cameras were rolling, the lights glaring, and the tension so thick you could almost hear it hum. Millions of viewers tuned in that night, expecting a spirited debate, but no one expected what would come out of Alan Dershowitz's mouth. With a smirk that seemed rehearsed, he leaned forward into his microphone and cut through the conversation with a single, dismissive swipe. "Frankly," he sneered, "a degree from a school like yours hardly qualifies you to debate the Constitution." With me, gasps rippled through the studio. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. You could feel the weight of it pressing down, as if every eye in the country had turned to see how Jasmine Crockett would react. Here was a man who had spent decades cloaked in prestige, who carried the smug confidence of Harvard hallways and high-profile cases. And here was a black woman from Texas, her path carved not through privilege but through grit, sacrifice, and the relentless will to prove herself in a system that was never built to welcome her. For a split second, Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't scowl, didn't let her eyes dart nervously the way Dershowitz might have expected. Instead, she simply stared at him. The studio lights glinted against her calm expression, and in that stillness lay a power more unsettling than any shouted rebuttal. The audience began to murmur. Some viewers at home rewound their feeds, making sure they heard him correctly. Social media within seconds lit up with fire emojis and exclamation points. The insult wasn't just about a law degree. It was about hierarchy, about who gets to speak and who is told to sit quietly and take notes. Dershowitz's jab landed like a slap across decades of struggle, as though he was speaking not just to Crockett, but to every outsider who ever dared step into the so-called ivory tower. The moment had all the makings of a televised humiliation. That was the intent, to put her in her place. To remind her and everyone watching that pedigree still mattered more than principle. But what Dershowitz didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had come armed with more than a degree. And what happened next didn't just silence the room it left. America rethinking who truly owns the law, to understand why that insult cut so deep, and why the response that followed would reverberate far beyond a television studio. You have to step back and look at the climate in which it happened. America wasn't simply watching two lawyers spar over case law. This was a clash of eras, of identities, of power itself. The nation had been simmering with debates about race, gender, and who holds the keys to authority in public life. Every exchange in that studio carried the weight of those larger battles. Alan Dershowitz entered the conversation as more than just a legal scholar. To some, he was a towering figure of intellectual prestige, the Harvard professor who defended presidents, who advised world leaders, who always seemed to have the last word in constitutional arguments. But to others, he represented something else entirely, the arrogance of an elite class that believed credentials could outweigh character, and pedigree could eclipse lived experience. He didn't just bring his resume to the stage. He brought decades of privilege and the unspoken message. No one outside his circle truly belonged at the table. On the other side stood Jasmine Crockett. Not yet a household name, she embodied a very different America, the daughter of working-class roots, the product of relentless perseverance. She represented voices too often dismissed, communities too often told their degrees, their knowledge, their lived truths were somehow less than. She was young. She was black. She was a woman, and all three identities made her very existence on that stage a defiance of the order Dershowitz symbolized. That night, when Dershowitz dismissed her law degree, it wasn't just an insult to Crockett. It was a message to anyone watching who had ever been told they didn't measure up. It was a reminder of the glass ceiling still intact, of the silent barriers that no resume bullet point could seem to shatter. His words carried the sting of exclusion, and millions watching at home felt it. This is why the moment mattered. This is why people leaned forward in their seats, their hearts pounding, waiting to see what would happen next. Because this wasn't just about statutes and precedents. This was about whether America would continue to bow to the polished arrogance of the old Gardor, whether a new generation, forged not in ivory towers, but in the fires of struggle, would finally claim their space in the conversation. Viewers didn't just see a debate. They witnessed a line drawn in the sand. On one side, the establishment clinging to its titles and traditions. On the other, the future insisting that resilience, truth, and courage could outshine any diploma embossed with an elite seal. And so the air grew heavy with anticipation. Social feeds began to pulse, hashtags forming in real time, people asking the same question: would Crockett back down? Would she let it slide, the way so many before her had been forced to swallow insults and move on? Or would she seize this moment in front of the nation to deliver a response so sharp, so undeniable, that even Dershowitz himself would have no choice but to reckon with it? The answer was coming. And when Crockett stepped up to speak, Number 1 expected this to understand the sting in Alan Dershowitz's words. You need to understand the man himself. For decades, Dershowitz has been one of the most recognizable names in American law. It's the kind of name that makes judges lean forward, reporters scramble for sound bites, and students at Harvard whisper about in lecture halls. He was the youngest professor ever granted tenure at Harvard Law School, a prodigy whose sharp mind cut through legal texts like a scalpel. His resume reads like a hall of fame for constitutional law books published, cases argued, precedents shaped, but brilliance has always walked hand in hand with arrogance. Dershowitz didn't just thrive on the battlefield of ideas. He relished it. He carried himself as though he were untouchable, as though his word alone could settle an argument. To some, that confidence was intoxicating proof of genius. To others, it was suffocating, a mask for condescension. For every admirer who praised his intellect, there were critics who warned of his habit of steamrolling opponents, dismissing perspectives that didn't fit neatly into his world of elite. Validation: his career highlights sparkle with controversy as much as accomplishment. He defended high-profile figures accused of the indefensible O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, even advising presidents when their legacies hung in the balance. Each case brought him notoriety. Each client draped him in headlines. To some, this proved his commitment to the principle that everyone deserves a defense. To others, it looked like a man drawn to power, willing to lend his talents to the wealthy and infamous. No matter the moral stain, what made Dershowitz so commanding was not just his knowledge, but his ability to weaponize it. He could make a courtroom, a lecture hall, or a TV studio feel like his kingdom. He spoke with a rhythm designed to overwhelm, to intimidate. His opponents often found themselves struggling to catch their breath, cornered by rapid-fire logic wrapped in polished confidence. This wasn't just debate, it was domination. And Dershowitz thrived on it. Yet behind the grandeur of his accomplishments lay contradictions. Here was a man who championed civil liberties, yet seemed blind to the lived experiences of those. Without his privileges, he wrote about fairness and justice, yet aligned himself with clients who represented the very rot people were desperate to fight against. He claimed devotion to truth, yet critics accused him of bending it when convenient. His name carried both admiration and suspicion, as though brilliance and compromise were forever entwined in his story. For Dershowitz, prestige was more than professional, it was personal. Harvard wasn't just his employer, it was his armor. The ivory tower gave him not only a platform, but also an aura of superiority, a shield that turned every challenge into something beneath him. And so, when he looked across the studio stage and saw Jasmine Crockett, a freshman lawmaker, a black woman from Texas, he didn't see a worthy opponent. He saw someone to be dismissed, someone who couldn't possibly match his decades of reputation. That's what made the insult sting so sharply. It wasn't just about the paper degree, it was about hierarchy. In his eyes, her credentials could never measure up, not against the Harvard brand etched into his very identity. He had lived too long in a world that reinforced this belief. Students revered him, networks booked him, presidents listened to him, so he believed his place was unshakable. But arrogance has a way of blinding giants. What Dershowitz underestimated was not Crockett's degree, but her resolve. He forgot that while prestige can dazzle, it can also isolate. While elite power breeds confidence, it also breeds vulnerability when confronted with authenticity, resilience, and lived truth. Dershowitz had built a career on being the smartest man in the room. For decades, that had been enough. But that night, in that studio, he was about to face something he hadn't calculated. for a challenger who wasn't playing by the old rules, because Crockett didn't come armed with Harvard polish. She came armed with the weight of communities he had never lived in, the scars of battles he had never fought, and the courage to stand in a room designed to silence her and speak anyway. And that's where the story shifts, because what happens? When the giant underestimates the woman he thought was just a rookie, long before she ever stood on a stage across from Alan Dershowitz, Jasmine Crockett had already been fighting battles most of America never saw. Her story doesn't begin in a courtroom or a campaign office. It begins in the neighborhoods of Texas, where she was raised in a working-class family that knew the value of every dollar, every sacrifice, every extra hour of labor just to keep the lights on. Hers was not a life gilded by privilege. It was a life carved out of persistence. From an early age, Jasmine saw the gap between what America promised and what her community received. She saw classmates disciplined unfairly, neighbors treated differently by law enforcement, families fighting to be heard in systems that looked right past them. Where some children dreamed of escape, Jasmine's spirit turned toward justice. She carried the quiet fire of someone who refused to believe that inequality was permanent. When she decided to pursue law, it wasn't out of vanity. It wasn't to hang a diploma on the wall for admiration. It was survival and service. She entered college knowing she would have to outwork nearly everyone around her, because the system wasn't built with her in mind. Professors sometimes questioned her presence. Classmates underestimated her before she even opened her mouth. Each doubt became fuel. Each whisper of not good enough hardened her determination. Law school wasn't just a degree program for her. It was a crucible. She balanced long hours of study with jobs that paid the bills. While some of her peers had parents who could fund internships and clerkships, Jasmine took the harder road, relying on her own grit. Every page she read late at night was powered by coffee and resolve. Every exam was more than an academic hurdle. It was another chance to prove she belonged in a space that tried to edge her out. By the time she earned her degree, it carried a weight no critic could belittle. It wasn't just a certificate. It was evidence of survival. She wasn't armed with the connections of an Ivy League network, but with the lived wisdom of struggle, community, and resilience. And that wisdom quickly became her weapon as she turned to practice law not in the comfort of corporate skyscrapers, but in the trenches of civil rights. Jasmine made her name defending those without power. She took on cases others overlooked, stood beside clients others dismissed, and made sure that people who had been silenced finally had a voice in court. She fought for people pushed to the margins, working mothers, black men profiled by police, immigrant families tangled in bureaucracy. Each victory was less about personal glory and more about restoring dignity to those who had been stripped of it. Her career wasn't without scars. She faced resistance in courtrooms, sometimes from opposing counsel, sometimes even from judges who looked down their bench as if she didn't belong. She endured the weight of being a black woman in spaces where those two identities alone could feel like disqualifications. But every insult, every attempt to sideline her, only sharpened her resilience. She didn't fold. She didn't retreat. She rose. That resilience followed her into politics. When Jasmine Crockett stepped into public office, she didn't enter with the polish of a career politician. She entered with the fire of an advocate, someone who had spent her life in the trenches, who knew firsthand the stakes of inequality. Her speeches carried the rhythm of lived truth, her policies shaped by the faces of the clients she had defended. She wasn't there to climb a ladder. She was there to break ceilings, to her supporters. Crockett symbolized something bigger than herself. She represented the possibility that America could still grow into its promise, that young women from working-class families could rise, that black voices could speak in halls of power, not as tokens, but as leaders, that the struggle of her community wasn't wasted, but transformed into fuel for change. And yet, even as her star rose, the doubters never disappeared. Commentators labeled her inexperienced, opponents dismissed her as radical, and in elite circles, whispers continued, did she really belong at the same table as the great legal minds of the nation? Every doubt was a familiar echo, every insult a reminder of the battles she had fought since the very beginning. But Crockett had learned something long ago, that the measure of a person's worth is not in the pedigree of their degree, but in the purpose of their work. While some flaunted diplomas, she carried victories etched into the lives she changed. While others leaned on privilege, she leaned on principle. And in the end, that gave her a strength no resume could replicate. So, when she sat across from Alan Dershowitz, she didn't bring the armor of prestige. She brought the scars of struggle, the lessons of perseverance, and the unshakable calm of someone who had already endured the worst and kept going. Her presence alone was a testament to survival, her voice a reminder that power is not inherited, is earned, and all those battles prepared her for the moment she'd face one of the sharpest legal minds in America. The cameras stayed locked. The lights burned hot. Across that polished studio table, the tension snapped like static in the air. Dershowitz leaned in first. His voice cut across the conversation with the sharpness of a gavel. "Congresswoman," he said, pausing just long enough to sound patronizing. "With all due respect, your understanding of the law is, well, it's elementary." Gasps. A few chuckles from those who expected him to dominate. Crockett didn't flinch. She folded her hands. Calm, measured, eyes locked on him, as if waiting for the storm to pass. But the storm only grew louder. Dershowitz pressed on, interrupting, slicing through her attempts to respond. "See, that's the problem with today's politicians. They skim a few textbooks, win a few elections, and suddenly think they understand constitutional nuance. Harvard teaches rigor. Experience teaches mastery. Frankly, I don't hear either in your remarks." The jab landed heavy. Viewers at home leaned closer. The audience in the studio shifted in their seats. The air was thick with that familiar imbalance, the giant bearing down on the challenger. Crockett's lips parted as she tried to answer, only to be cut off again. No, Dershowitz said, waving a hand as though swatting away a child's interruption. "Let me finish. You're oversimplifying issues that require decades of scholarship. These aren't community meetings. These are constitutional questions." The crowd murmured, some uneasy, some enthralled, but Crockett remained still. Her composure was striking, where another might have cracked, or raised their voice, or snapped back in frustration. She simply breathed. She let him spill his arrogance across the stage, let him perform for the cameras, let him show every ounce of disdain. Her silence became louder than his words, and that silence began to work on the room. Viewers could feel the imbalance. The studio audience began to frown. Shifts, crossed arms, side eyes. It was no longer just a clash of opinions. It was the spectacle of a man attempting to bulldoze a woman he underestimated. Finally, when the moderator tried to redirect Dershowitz, cut them off too. His tone swelled, self-satisfied. "Listen, if we want to have a serious conversation, it needs to be between people who actually understand the law. Frankly, I don't have time for slogans." The words hung there, dismissal, condescension. A line meant to crush her, but Crockett didn't bow her head. She didn't scramble. She didn't break. Instead, she leaned forward, just slightly. The studio lights caught her eyes, steady and sharp. Her voice, when it finally came, was low, calm, controlled, the kind of voice that demanded attention without raising a single decibel. And the room felt it, because composure in the face of arrogance isn't weakness. It's power. Dershowitz had played his hand. Early mockery, interruption, dismissal. He expected rattling. He expected her to crack, to rush, to stumble. Instead, she absorbed every blow like stone against water, and the crowd began to sense something shifting. The giant had thrown his weight, but the rookie? She was still standing. The silence between them grew heavy. The cameras lingered. America waited. And then Crockett dropped the first strike that nobody saw coming. The silence stretched, thick enough to cut. Dershowitz had unleashed a barrage of dismissals, every word designed to diminish, to belittle. Sat back in his chair, smug in his expectation that she would stumble. But when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward, the calm in her face sent a ripple through the room. Her voice came low at first, deliberate, "Professor," she began with a composure that silenced even the whispers in the crowd, "I respect your years in the classroom, but let me tell you about the years I spent in the courtroom." The first strike landed soft, almost gentle. A measured tone, not sharp. But beneath it, there was steel. I didn't walk into a hall full of eager law students, already dreaming of clerkships and partnerships. I walked into courtrooms where my clients were terrified. Mothers who worked 2 jobs but were about to lose their homes. Young men pulled over for the color of their skin. Families watching their loved ones deported. That was my textbook, Professor. That was my syllabus. The audience shifted. A hush fell deeper. The contrast was drawn. His ivory tower, her lived trenches. "And you know what the Constitution looks like from that vantage point?" she asked, her tone steady. "It doesn't look like a theory. It looks like a lifeline." Dershowitz adjusted in his seat. For the first time, his smile thinned. Crockett pressed on with precision. "You say I oversimplify. But sometimes the law is made complicated by those who want to keep power out of reach. The truth is simple. Equal protection means equal protection. Due process means due process. And no amount of academic gymnastics changes that." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. She didn't stop there. She leaned in further, eyes locked on him, as if to remind him that this wasn't a classroom where he could lecture. "Unchallenged? You dismiss slogans?" "Well, let me remind you, we the people started as a slogan too, the most powerful one of all. And every fight for justice since then has been about making those words real." That line hit like a drumbeat. Viewers at home were already clipping it, tweeting it, replaying it in their heads. Dershowitz tried to interject, but his voice caught in the momentum of her rebuttal. "Professor, you've defended presidents, billionaires, men who had every advantage money could buy. I defended people who couldn't even afford bail. You say Harvard teaches rigor, so does fighting for clients when the whole system is stacked against them? You call my experience elementary? It's because you've never been forced to learn how the law fails people in real time." The studio audience erupted cheers, gasps, applause that the moderator struggled to calm. Crockett didn't break eye contact. She let the noise swell, then recede before speaking again. She moved methodically now, dismantling his talking points with surgical precision. When he had claimed she misunderstood constitutional nuance, she countered with case law Brown v. Board, Gideon v. Wainwright, Shelby County v. Holder, each citation woven into a larger story about rights withheld and rights fought for. Wasn't lecturing. She was storytelling with authority. "Nuance without humanity is just noise," she said. "And if the law can't serve the people, then it serves no one at all." The moderator leaned back, stunned. Legal experts on the panel wore the kind of frozen half-smiles of people who knew they were watching something historic, and Dershowitz, once animated, once booming, had grown quieter. He fiddled with his pen. His rebuttals came shorter, clipped, defensive. The confidence had cracked. Crockett sensed it, and she pressed harder. "You say experience teaches mastery. On that, I agree. My mastery comes from listening to people this system forgot. From standing beside them when everyone else told them to stand alone. And if you think that's elementary, then maybe, Professor, you've forgotten what the law was supposed to be for." The audience erupted again, louder this time, applause rolling through the studio. The camera cut to faces, some smiling, some in awe, some simply stunned at the composure of a woman who refused to be diminished. She let the noise crest once more before delivering the final blow. Her voice dropped even lower, forcing the audience to lean in. "You see, Professor," she said, pausing long enough to let the silence work, "the difference between you and me is that you treat the Constitution like theory. I treat it like oxygen. Because for the people I fight for, it's the only thing keeping them alive in a system that wants them suffocated." Gasps. Applause. The kind of roar that felt less like an audience response and more like a verdict. Dershowitz opened his mouth, then closed it again. His hand rested on the table, tense, motionless. The smile was gone. The interruption was gone. For once, Alan Dershowitz had nothing to say. and Crockett, sensing the moment, leaned back in her chair, not smug, not gloating, simply resolute. She had not raised her voice, not descended into insult, not met arrogance with arrogance. She had met it with truth, and truth had won. The cameras caught it all. Dershowitz staring down at his notes. Crockett calm as stone, the audience on its feet. Legal experts would replay that moment for weeks, not because of the theatrics, but because of the clarity. She had done what so many thought impossible. She had made the giant look small. Her closing words came like a verdict. The law doesn't belong to Harvard. It doesn't belong to billionaires. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. And no amount of arrogance will ever change that. The applause shook the room. The moderator tried to regain control, but the energy was beyond containment. Crockett had delivered the strike, the takedown, a moment that would echo across Timeline's talk shows and living rooms for months. By the time she finished, the so-called expert had no choice but to sit in silence. The debate ended, but the echoes began instantly. Within minutes, phones lit up across the country. Clips of Crockett's calm, dismantling of Dershowitz flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The first hashtag was simple, sharp. It's impossible to ignore. #Crockett crushes Dershowitz. It spread like wildfire. Users clipped her line about the Constitution being oxygen, pairing it with slow-motion replays and dramatic captions. This is what leadership looks like. The moment Dershowitz fell silent became a meme captioned with lines like, "When you realize you're not the smartest person in the room." By the end of the night, the hashtag had trended, not just nationally, but globally. Commentators in London, Toronto, and Johannesburg weighed in, marveling at how a congresswoman from Texas had just humbled one of America's most famous legal giants. And then came the legal community. Professors who once lectured alongside Dershowitz tweeted, "Respect where it's due. Crockett just gave a masterclass in real-world constitutionalism." Former prosecutors called her rebuttal textbook precision, while defense attorneys praised her ability to merge law with lived experience. Reaction videos poured in, YouTubers replaying the moment, adding their own gasps and cheers. TikTok teens reenacted her final lines with cinematic music in the background. Even comedians jumped on board, joking that Dershowitz had just auditioned for the role of a statue and nailed it. But it wasn't just laughs. There was reverence. 2.1 viral tweet read, "For every black woman who's been talked over in a meeting, for every first-gen student told they weren't good enough, this moment was for us." It racked up hundreds of thousands of likes, the comments section overflowing with stories of people who had lived that same dismissal and dreamed of answering back with Crockett's grace. The validation swelled. Viewers weren't just watching a debate. They were reliving their own struggles and finally seeing them answered. The audience didn't just admire Crockett. They saw themselves in her. Cable news caught on fast. MSNBC looped the exchange for hours, calling it the clapback. Heard around the world, CNN analysts dissected her rhetorical technique, some even suggesting it would be taught in debate classes. Fox News, scrambling, dismissed it as performance. But the clips spoke louder than their commentary millions had already seen, already judged, already shared. Late-night hosts joined in. One replayed Crockett's final line, "The law doesn't belong to Harvard," with thunderous applause from the audience, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new legal rock star in Congress." But perhaps the most powerful reactions came not from celebrities or pundits, but from ordinary people. Law students tweeted photos of themselves studying with the caption, "Doing this for Crockett." Immigrant families posted videos watching the clip together, nodding, clapping, some even crying. A teacher in Houston recorded her students, erupting into applause after she played the segment in class. The energy was palpable, a wave surging beyond politics. Crockett had transformed a televised debate into a cultural moment, and Dershowitz, he trended too, but for the wrong reasons. #silent Dershowitz, #overruled, #professor owned. Clips of his fidgeting, his shrinking confidence. His silence at the end circulated as cautionary tales of arrogance collapsing under truth. For a man who once dominated courtrooms and classrooms, the sting was undeniable. By mourning the story, had fully left the studio. News outlets reported that Crockett's campaign donations spiked overnight. Her website traffic quadrupled. Volunteers flooded in, asking how they could support her. She had, in one evening, shifted her national profile from rising star to certified force. And the impact wasn't only political, it was deeply personal. In Facebook groups, Black women professionals shared the clip with captions like this: "Is how you answer when they underestimate you." In immigrant forums, people celebrated the way she invoked lived experience against elitist arrogance. Even high schoolers shared it on Snapchat, writing, "She's us, for real." It became more than a moment. It became a mirror, reflecting back pride and dignity to people who had long been told to sit quietly, to wait their turn, to accept dismissal. But the ripple didn't stop with likes, shares, and hashtags, because Crockett's words, though sharp, unshakable, oxygen-filled words would not remain confined to the digital realm. They began surfacing in unexpected places. Professors played the clip in classrooms. Judges referenced it in casual remarks. Young lawyers repeated her lines in bar association meetings. What started as a televised clash had begun transforming into a wider cultural current. And that was only the beginning, because it wasn't just online chatter. The ripple effect reached courtrooms, classrooms, and even Congress. When the noise of the debate finally faded, when the hashtags slowed and the screens dimmed, something larger remained. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had silenced a famed Harvard professor on live television. It was that she revealed a truth far bigger than the clash of two voices. Dignity is louder than arrogance. What viewers witnessed wasn't only a political skirmish. It was a parable about power. Dershowitz came armed with prestige, decades of reputation, and the assumption that his name alone would secure victory. Crockett entered with only her preparation, her lived experience, and the unshakable calm that comes from knowing you belong in every room. Comes from knowing you belong in every room you walk into. And when those two forces met, it wasn't the resume that won. It was the resolve. For millions watching, Crockett's composure became more than admirable. It became instructive. Showed what happens when someone refuses to bow to belittlement. When someone meets arrogance, not with louder arrogance, but with discipline, clarity, and patience. In that moment, she carried not just herself, but every person who has ever been told they don't measure up. The lesson reached beyond law, beyond politics. It landed in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces. It whispered to the student second-guessing their worth. It spoke to the worker ignored in meetings. It affirmed the parent balancing two jobs, the immigrant child translating for their family, the Black woman rising in a field that was never built for her. Crockett's triumph told them, "You are enough." And when you prepare, when you stand in truth, no amount of elitism can erase your voice. It was also a reminder to the powerful that arrogance, no matter how loud, always has a breaking point. Privilege without humility eventually collapses under its own weight. Dershowitz's silence in the final seconds wasn't simply a debate. It was the sound of entitlement meeting its limit. In every era, moments like this reset the story of who gets to speak with authority. Crockett's rebuttal will be remembered not because it was flashy, but because it was undeniable. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to insult, didn't need to bend to the game. She won by being grounded in the very thing arrogance can. Never counterfeit authenticity. And that is why her victory carried such weight. Because it wasn't just about besting one man. It was about proving that truth, rooted in dignity, always outlasts the performance of superiority. The world is full of Dershowitz figures' voices that lean on status, privilege, or the illusion of invincibility. But Crockett's stand reminds us that history does not remember the loudest talker. History remembers the one who spoke with clarity, conviction, and purpose. For her, the courtroom wasn't the only arena. The studio, the stage, even the nation itself became her witness. And when the curtain closed, what lingered wasn't arrogance. It was dignity. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about a professor and a congresswoman. It was a story about all of us. It's about what it means to hold your ground, to answer insult with principle, to let preparation carry you further than privilege ever could, and it left behind a truth, impossible to ignore, because when dignity speaks, arrogance falls silent. Alan Dershowitz thought his credentials were enough to intimidate. He thought a Harvard title and decades in the spotlight could belittle a woman who built her career brick by brick, case by case, community by community. But in that studio, the opposite happened. Crockett stood tall. Dershowitz shrank. And that's why this moment matters. It wasn't just a clash between two legal minds. It was a reminder that the law doesn't belong to the loudest, the richest, or the most decorated. It belongs to the people. And when someone like Jasmine Crockett carries that truth with courage, it changes everything. This is why her response stunned not only Dershowitz, but the entire nation of experts, commentators, and ordinary Americans watching at home. Because she embodied the lesson that's bigger than politics, bigger than party, bigger than ego. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. That's the story we tell here. The story of voices rising against the odds, of people refusing to be silenced, of truth outshining privilege. And if you felt that fire tonight, if you saw yourself in Crockett's resolve, then this is your space. Subscribe, join this community, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder they belong to. Because titles fade, fame fades. But truth does not. Remember this, truth is greater than titles. Dignity is greater than arrogance. People are greater than privilege. And as long as voices like Jasmine Crockett's keep rising, arrogance will always fall silent.